Okay, so what is the nervous system, right? Well, you got a lot of cells, right? The cell doctrine applies into the brain as well, and the rest of the nervous system, which we're going to see extends into the periphery of the body. So it's made up of cells, and these cells include neurons, which we're going to be talking quite a bit about. Neurons are really unique cells that have like a cell body hidden in here, all these kinds of projections off of them, that are called dendrites, and then these kind of wire-like extensions known as axons, and then these termini, these endpoints, these axon terminals, where the electric signal is going to be converted into the release of a chemical called a neurotransmitter, and then that's going to meet up with another cell, right, at another, let's say, dendrite here, and it's going to influence its function, right? So the nervous system is made up of a lot of these cells called neurons. In addition, there are what they used to be referred to more as support cells, called glial cells. Glia is Greek for glue, sort of the glue that puts the brain and the nervous system together. But we've realized in recent years that the glial cells are extraordinarily important for all sorts of functions, including the processing and transfer of information. And so we'll talk a little bit more about the importance of glial cells as we continue with this class. Another huge issue, of course, is that for a long time it was thought that there were many, many more glial cells than neurons, and that's not true. It turns out in the adult brain, there's probably about 86 billion neurons, and about a similar number of glial cells. The ratio will differ a little bit in different tissues, but it's about 1-to-1, the neuron-glial ratio. So how do you got like a huge, complicated, networked system that, comprises the nervous system. How do you even begin to approach it? Well, there's two sort of main approaches that are sort of taken, sort of like kind of theoretical approaches. One is like sort of dividing up the nervous system structurally, and then seeing if you can say something about the functions of different regions, by virtue of their location, or by virtue of what's connected to what. So for example, we talk about the brain, right? This big chunk, this thing here called this is the cerebrum. This portion here is the cerebellum, right? And the spinal cord. Here's the brain stem right here, and then it goes down. This portion is the spinal cord. It's not actually illustrated here, but it runs down your spine. And the brain and the spinal cord collectively are referred to as the central nervous system, or the CNS. And outside the central nervous system, well, you'll find lots of neurons. You'll find lots of what are called sensory or afferent neurons, like neurons that are have their tips here in your your projections here in your fingertip. They can carry information about touch or injury, right? Or pressure, or that sense of body position we call proprioception. So afferent information, there's big cables of these neurons that are carrying information back towards the central nervous system, the spinal cord, and then up towards the brain, are components of the peripheral nervous system. There's also, of course, output from the central nervous system to the body, to the muscles of the body, to move you around, right? So that output, that motor output, is also referred to as efferent output. So there's efferent cables, extending from neurons that are found in the spinal cord, for example, and brainstem, out to muscles of the body in the periphery. In addition, there are going to be synaptic connections, right? There's going to be places where one neuron, maybe let's say, a neuron coming out of the spinal cord is going to meet another neuron, and there's going to be neurotransmitter released and a connection made, right? Information transferred. And these clumps of neurons, of like the connections between neurons and the neuron cell bodies, etc., that's gray matter. And we're going to see there are clumps of gray matter in the peripheral nervous system, outside the central nervous system. And we call those clumps ganglia. So in the central nervous system, if you have a clump of, neurons that are located below the surface of the brain. Now, the surface of the brain, this kind of wrinkled outer surface, right, is given a special name because it's the bark of the brain. So it's named for the Latin word for bark, which is cortex. Well, below the cortex, there are also clumps of gray matter, where there's going to be synaptic connections made and cell bodies found, right? And these we typically refer to as nuclei. So that's a confusing term, right? Because a nucleus is also found in the middle of a cell, right, where the DNA is located. But in the brain, if you talk about subcortical nuclei, you're talking about clumps of neurons, that are found, below the cortex, subcortical clumps that are interconnected with other regions, basically, of, the brain. And you can say something just by virtue of the location of, neurons, networks of neurons you find in the brain versus the spinal cord versus the peripheral nervous system. You could say, for example, in the PNS, the peripheral nervous system, with all those ganglia and nerves, both afferent and efferent, this is really important for detection of sensory information, right? For the actual motor responses and activity, the sort of reflexive responses that are occurring, in networks that are localized in the peripheral nervous system, or maybe have short extensions into the central nervous system. You can say the spinal cord is absolutely critical, right, for transferring that afferent information up to networks in the brain, and also for, sort of higher level, complex sort of behavioral commands and responses, like I'm going to pick up this brain, I'm going to remove the sterile, like all these sorts of things, basically, transiting down and out to the body. So it's a very important conduit for both afferent input and motor output, right? And then the brain itself, this is where, the bulk of those 86 billion neurons in the adult are found, and many, many, many glial cells as well. Well, you can, definitely, have an assumption here around this is critically important for, kind of higher cognitive functions, right? Aspects of memory and language, decision-making, social decision-making, perception, etc. Just by virtue of, structural sort of